Okay, so Cat Stanley here, Space Demon coming at you. And I recently got an opportunity, free trial offer of the Audible, books on tape app. I don't know, they don't call them books on tape, I guess audio books. The Audible app where they have a bunch of audio books and whatnot you can get. Typically, I've always been a big reader, so if there's a book out there I want to read, usually I just go out and buy it or check it out from the local library or whatnot. But, I was on Amazon. They had a free trial offer of this Audible app, and they had a free book that came with it. So I decided to get it, and I got this book called Fine Line Between Stupid and Clever. It's a story of Spinal Tap, and very interesting stuff, because it turns out that Mr. Paul Stanley auditioned for that original movie. This is Spinal Tap. So you might know the legendary film rock mockumentary came out in 1984, of course, about the fictitious band which would become an actual band, Spinal Tap, which was made up of Christopher Guest as Nigel Tufnell on lead guitar, David St. Hubbins, played by Michael McKean, the rhythm guitarist, and Harry Shearer, who would later go on to be on The Simpsons and all that stuff, played Derek Smalls, the bass player. Now, when they were casting the movie, directed by Rob Reiner, you may know him best as the Meathead, even though he has done a lot of stuff since All in the Family. He's directed a lot of movies, of course, was part of Castle Rock, the production team that created Seinfeld. So he's done a lot of stuff. But his first directorial debut was This Is Spinal Tap. And when they were casting the movie, they needed two other musicians to round out the band. They were looking for a keyboard player and a drummer. And as Meathead describes in the book, here's what he says about filling those two positions. He says, "For a brief moment, we considered filling out the band with a couple of well-known musicians. We actually had meetings with Paul Stanley of Kiss and John Densmore from The Doors." Now, I'm trying to figure out, since they were trying to find a keyboard player and a drummer, they ultimately would go with David Caff, who played Vic Savage. The keyboard player was actually a professional keyboardist, a British musician who played with an English prog rock group called Rare Bird, and a guy called Rick Parnell who played Mick Shrimpton, another British musician who was a drummer in a group called Atomic Rooster. But we're trying to fill the slots of keyboard player and drummer. Kind of makes you wonder what Paul Stanley would have been interviewed for, which part. Certainly not the drummer. I mean, he's not a drummer. Keyboardist, he's not a keyboardist either. Now, what crossed my mind is, this took place, 40 some odd years ago when they were casting the movie. It was 1982. It crossed my mind that maybe it could have been Peter Criss and not Paul Stanley. Maybe the Meathead misremembers it. He remembers Kiss, but he got the band members mixed up. I don't know, because that would have been around the time after Peter had left the band. He would have been a free agent. And of course, there's an urban legend out there you might be familiar with. The actor Michael McKean, who was in Spinal Tap, of course, was in Laverne and Shirley, and he had a comedy partner called David Lander. They played Lenny and Squiggy on that show, Laverne and Shirley, and they actually had a group who recorded a comedy music album called Lenny and the Squigtones, and the guy that played drums on that record bore a rough resemblance to Peter Criss, and there was an urban legend out there that it was actually Peter Criss who played on that record, and it turns out that has since been debunked by not only Peter Criss, but Michael McKean as well. And forgive me, I don't know the drummer's name right now. I didn't look it up. You can look it up, but it's definitely, if you're a Kiss fan, you look at the guy's picture and you say, yeah, he kind of looks like Peter Criss did back in the day, but it's definitely not Peter Criss. But that's kind of interesting because, I don't know, could Paul Stanley have even been in that movie if he wanted to? Because This Is Spinal Tap was shot November 8th, and they shot, it was a 5-week shooting schedule, so that would have gone into mid-November 1982. Now, the release of Creatures of the Night was October 25th, just less than 2 weeks, or about 2 weeks before they started shooting This Is Spinal Tap, and the Creatures of the Night tour wouldn't start until December 29th of that year. So theoretically, Paul would have been able to squeeze that in that 5 weeks shooting schedule between the time of the release date of Creatures of the Night and the beginning of the tour. But when a record is released, they got to do promotion, they got to do interviews, they're talking to radio stations. And then, you got to rehearse for a tour. You got a new record, plus they had a new band. Vinnie Vincent was the new guitarist. They had to work with him. So the idea that he would have been able to shoot a movie between the release of Creatures of the Night and the beginning of that tour seems a bit unlikely, but you never know, because Paul Stanley has talked about in the past how during the early 80s, he did have an interest in acting. He actually studied at the Actors Studio. You might remember James Lipton had the TV show Inside the Actors Studio. I don't think Paul didn't actually study at the Actors Studio. I think you have to get in there. You actually have to know how to act. I think they actually suss you out before they let you in the Actors Studio. You actually have to audition. You have to have acting talent. So I think what it was, he studied with somebody who had maybe attended the Actors Studio. He took some acting classes anyways, and he always bitched about, if you remember, Gene Simmons had his acting career in the 80s back at that time. He was very jealous of Gene Simmons because Paul was the one who initially had taken an interest in acting before Gene Simmons started making those movies like Runaway, and Paul always thought that here he was taking acting classes and trying to break into the business the right way by actually auditioning for roles and maybe reading for something like Spinal Tap. And here Gene, he always accused Gene of using his contacts with Kiss to finagle his way into those acting roles, which take that what you will. I think maybe that might have been part of it, to be honest with you, but I think that, I don't know, if Paul Stanley really had the acting talent, I think, and somebody would have put him in a movie. But anyways, so to think that Paul Stanley, they thought about him for that role in This and Spinal Tap. But I tell you what, I don't think, obviously he couldn't have been the drummer, he couldn't have been the keyboardist, but there is a role he might have been good for. Now, if you remember the scene in the hotel lobby, there's a fictitious rock star called Duke Fame, who ended up being played by a guy called Paul Shortino, who was something of an obscure heavy metal rock singer at that point, but has Rob Reiner talks about in the book, Shortino, who was a musician by trade, he had the look of a rock star, but he didn't have the comedic acting chops to really hang with guys who were professional improvisers, professional comedians, because This Is Spinal Tap wasn't a traditional movie in the sense that there wasn't a script. They had scenes set, but the scenes themselves were improvised, and as it turns out, Paul Shortino, who played Duke Fame, didn't have the comedic chops. So what they ended up doing at the very last minute, they brought in Howard Hessman from WKRP in Cincinnati fame, Dr. Johnny Fever, to play the Duke's manager. And essentially Duke was a mute in the movie, didn't really speak, and they had Howard Hesseman doing all the speaking. And if you remember that scene, it's a classic scene in the movie. And I guess Hesseman was the one who came up with the line about, hey, we'd love to talk to you, but we got to go sit in the lobby and wait for the limo. And he's also the one who came up with the term enormodome too. So it was a classic scene that was created because this Paul Shortino couldn't really improvise, so they brought in Hesseman, and the rest is history. But I think Paul Stanley could have played that role of the Duke fame. He could have, that is something that maybe he could have done. He could have just stood there and not said anything. He maybe would have been that, but you know, I was thinking about it initially when Reiner said this, that wow, I'm really glad that Paul Stanley wasn't in this as Spinal Tap, because he doesn't seem like he would have fit in. You know, he would have ruined the movie, thank God. And I love Paul Stanley, but in terms of being in this as Spinal Tap, I mean, Paul's great with Kiss, everything that he does. But he's got a lot of cringe moments, and I thought maybe he wouldn't have been right for Spinal Tap. But that Duke fame role, I think he could have pulled that off. But, you know, it's just to stand there while Howard Hesseman and all the other guys delivered the funny lines. But interesting story. I've never heard Paul Stanley mention this at all. He didn't mention it in his memoir. I've never seen him or heard him mention it in an interview. So when I heard the meathead say that, I was kind of knocked off of my ass. But that's the video. Of course, this is Spinal Tap Part 2 is out in theaters right now. As much as I love the original movie, I don't go to movie theaters anymore. I probably won't be going to see it. Maybe I'll catch it when it comes to cable TV or basic cable or whatever. But as far as seeing it in a theater, I don't see myself doing that. But it's an interesting story. What do you guys think? Do you think Paul Stanley would have fit in the movie This is Spinal Tap? Or maybe Peter Criss? I don't know. Well, that's the video. Hope you dug it, and we'll see you next time.
Stanley the one-eared monster. Stanley the one-eared monster.
Who's here?